The rope hit Hugh Keating's hands just as the ground swallowed him to his chest. He had not screamed. He was not the kind of man who screamed. But the sound that tore from his throat when the earth moved beneath him like something alive and hungry was not entirely silent either, and the memory of it would embarrass him for years. The quicksand flats stretched out around him in every direction, a half-mile of pale, treacherous ground that looked like ordinary desert and killed like a trap, and he had walked straight into it, the way every overconfident man eventually walked into the thing that would humble him. The badge on his chest caught the late afternoon sun and threw light in useless directions. Marshal Hugh Keating of Cimarron County, New Mexico Territory, 1882, was sinking into the earth, and there was not another living soul within shouting distance. Except there was. He had heard the horse before he saw her, hooves moving in a careful, deliberate pattern that no ordinary rider would know, picking its way along some path he could not see. And then she appeared at the edge of the flat, a young woman on a dun-colored mare, and she looked at him with dark brown eyes that held precisely zero surprise. "You walked in off the South Trail," she said. It was not a question. "Get help," he said, because he was proud and she was a woman, and those two facts conspired against his good sense. "There is no time to get help," she said, already off her horse and moving, reaching into a saddlebag with practiced hands. "Stop struggling. The more you fight it, the faster it takes you." He stopped struggling. She pulled a coiled rope from the bag, shook it out with one expert motion, and studied the ground between them with an attention so focused, so quiet, that he felt the strange sensation of watching someone read a language he did not possess. She walked 3 steps to the left, planted her boot, tested her weight, moved 2 steps forward on a diagonal, tested again, and then she threw the rope to him with a precision that dropped the loop directly over his outstretched arms. "Pull your left arm out first," she said. "Slow. Rotate it toward your body, not away." He did exactly what she said because something in her voice made argument feel like stupidity, and his left arm came free with a horrible sucking sound. "Now lean forward as far as you can and brace your arms on the surface. Spread your weight. Do not push down with your hands." He did that too. "I am going to pull steady. Do not help me by pushing your legs down. Let them come up natural." And she pulled. She could not have weighed more than 130 pounds, and she pulled him, a man of 210, out of the quicksand flats of the New Mexico desert with a technique so deliberate and so knowledgeable that he came out of the earth with a sound like a cork from a bottle. And she did not fall backward, because she had already braced her feet against a buried shelf of sandstone that she had known was there. He lay on solid ground, filthy and gasping, and she stood over him, coiling her rope back with the calm efficiency of someone who had done difficult things many times, and he looked up at her and felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the fact that he had never in his 31 years on this earth met a woman who made him feel that thoroughly rescued. "You knew this ground," he said. "Yes," she said. "Every path across it." "Yes." "How?" She looked at him for a moment, and something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a wound, but something between the two. "My name is Ella Langley," she said. "My father owns the Langley Ranch 2 miles east of here. The quicksand flats sit between our eastern pasture and the county road. I have been mapping them since I was 14 years old." He sat up. He was covered in pale, wet sand. His dignity was somewhere at the bottom of the flat. His badge was still on his chest, which he figured counted for something. "Hugh Keating," he said. "Marshal." "I know who you are," she said. "Everyone in Cimarron County knows who you are. You are the man who came from Taos to investigate the cattle disappearances." She paused. "You are also the man who just walked into the only thing in this county more dangerous than the men you are investigating." He got to his feet slowly, testing each leg, feeling the cold, wet sand in his boots and against his skin, feeling the absurdity of the moment and the strange, electric awareness of her gaze. She was watching him with a measuring look, the kind a person gave a horse they were trying to determine was sound or broken. "I am sound," he said, without meaning to. Something in her expression shifted again, and this time it was definitely a smile, brief and brilliant as a match struck in a dark room. "Come on then, Marshal," she said, turning back toward her horse. "My father's house is 2 miles east. You can wash up there. And I imagine you will want to ask him some questions about those missing cattle." He followed her, because there was nothing else to do, and because he found himself intensely curious about the path she had walked to reach him across ground that looked uniform and lethal, and because she was already moving with purpose toward her horse without looking back to see if he was following, and he had the unsettling feeling that this was how she moved through the world, as if she already knew you would follow. 3 weeks before that afternoon in the Quicksand Flats, Hugh Keating had ridden into the town of Mesa Verde, New Mexico Territory, on a bay horse named Atlas with a set of warrants in his saddlebag, and a story that had been troubling him for 2 months. The story was this: 6 ranches in the southern reach of Cimarron County had lost cattle over the previous 8 months, not in the ones and twos that suggested local theft or predator loss, but in the dozens, sometimes hundreds, that suggested something organized. The local sheriff, a man named Crow who Hugh had immediately identified as either deeply corrupt or deeply incompetent, had filed 3 reports in 8 months, each one concluding with a variation on the phrase, "likely drifters." The ranchers had written to the territorial government, who had written to the marshal's office in Taos, and Hugh had drawn the assignment because he knew cattle country and he knew the kind of men who preyed on it. What he had not expected was the Langley Ranch. He had not expected it because it was not in his briefing. Of the 6 ranches that had reported losses, the Langley was not one of them. And yet when he had ridden out on his 3rd day to begin interviewing neighbors, every road in the eastern section of the county seemed to lead him in a circle back to the Langley's fence lines, to the Langley water rights, to the Langley name spoken with a complicated mixture of respect and resentment by the ranchers around it. "Langley hasn't lost a head," a rancher named Prout had told him, with a specific bitterness that said more than the words. "Not one. 8 months of it and not one head." Hugh had written that down. Now, walking Atlas behind Ella Langley's dun mare along a trail that wound east through scrub juniper and red rock, he had the opportunity to observe the woman who had saved his life, and to think about what that information meant in the context of an investigation he was no longer sure he understood. She rode the way she walked, with a self-contained competence that was more than skill and less than arrogance. She sat her saddle easy and balanced, reading her horse the way she read the Quicksand Flats, with that quiet, focused attention that seemed to cost her nothing. She wore a divided riding skirt in dark brown, a plain white shirtwaist, and a hat that had seen considerable weather. There was nothing fashionable about her, and nothing that was trying to be. She looked like someone who had decided a long time ago to be exactly as useful as she was, and nothing more performative than that. He guessed her age at 24 or 25. He found out later she was 26. The Langley Ranch revealed itself as they came around a stand of pinon pines, and it was not what he had been half expecting from the resentful tone of the neighboring ranchers. He had been expecting something imposing, something that announced wealth with the particular loudness of people who wanted you to know they had it. What he found instead was a working ranch of evident prosperity but no pretension, a large adobe main house with a deep front porch, a well-kept barn, several outbuildings in good repair, and a series of large corrals where cattle moved in the late afternoon light with the healthy, aimless contentment of well-managed animals. A man came off the porch as they rode into the yard. He was perhaps 60, broad through the chest and slow in his movements in the way of a man who had been strong all his life and still was, though the years had settled into him like sediment. His hair was white and his face was creased, and he had Ella's eyes, that same dark, measuring quality except where hers held curiosity, his held caution. "Papa," Ella said, dismounting, "this is Marshal Keating. He walked into the flats off the South Trail." Her father looked at Hugh with an expression that catalogued the pale, dried sand still caking his clothes and arrived at the obvious conclusion without any apparent satisfaction at it. "You are lucky she was out there," he said. "I am aware of that," Hugh said, which was the most sincere thing he had said to a stranger in longer than he could remember. "Caleb Langley," the man said, and extended his hand. The handshake was the handshake of a man who had nothing to hide, which meant nothing, because in Hugh's experience the men with the most to hide had often the most practiced handshakes. But there was something in Caleb Langley's face that was harder to calculate, a tiredness that looked real rather than performed, and a watchfulness that looked like a man who was waiting for something bad to happen rather than a man arranging for it. That distinction mattered. Hugh had learned to read it. Ella led him to a room off the back of the main house where he could wash, and she left a clean shirt outside the door that was close enough to his size to suggest she had estimated him accurately with one look, which he found both practical and slightly unnerving. He washed the sand off his skin and out of his hair, changed into the clean shirt, and came out to find that a supper had been laid, and that he had apparently been invited to it without anyone explicitly asking. He sat across the table from Caleb Langley and next to Ella, and for the first quarter hour of the meal they talked about nothing incriminating, which was itself a kind of information, because Hugh had learned that guilty men often talked too freely about the thing adjacent to their crime, the way a person touched the spot near an injury rather than the injury itself. Caleb Langley talked about water. He talked about the Cimarron River's behavior the past 2 years, about the shift in the spring rains, about the way the eastern range had dried and what it meant for the carrying capacity of the pastures. He talked about it with the fluency of a man who had been thinking about nothing else for months, and Hugh listened and ate Ella's very good cooking and thought about why a man whose cattle had not vanished was thinking about water with the intensity of a man whose cattle had. "The other ranchers," Hugh said, when there was a pause, "they tell me you have not lost stock." Caleb Langley set his fork down with a deliberateness that was not quite defensive but was not quite easy either. "That is correct," he said. "Any idea why?" A moment of silence crossed the table. Ella refilled Hugh's coffee without being asked, and he had the impression she was listening to the silence as carefully as she listened to everything else. "I have a thought about it," Caleb said, "but it is a thought that could make me some enemies." "You can tell me," Hugh said, "or I can spend 3 more weeks arriving at it on my own." Caleb looked at him for a long moment, then looked at Ella, and something passed between them that Hugh could not entirely read but understood in its general character as permission being sought and given. "The men taking the cattle," Caleb said, "they know this range. They know which ranches have good night watch and which ones are short-handed. They know where the fences run weak and where the stock water is. They have got information from inside. Someone close to the ranching community is feeding it to them. And your ranch?" "My ranch has Ella," Caleb said simply. "She mapped the flats. She mapped every water source, every trail, every weak fence line on this property before she was 18. She reorganized our night rotation 4 years ago. She knows this land the way most people do not know their own kitchen table, and any operation trying to move cattle through or around Langley land runs into that." He paused. "We also do not employ anyone we have not known for at least 5 years. Hugh looked at Ella, who was looking at her coffee cup with the particular expression of a woman who was accustomed to being talked about as a category of ranch asset, and had decided some time ago to accept it as the most useful way she was likely to be understood in a room full of men. He found he did not want to look at her that way. "Miss Langley," he said, and she looked up, "would you be willing to work with me? Share the maps?" She considered him. Not the way a woman considered a man who had asked her something she found flattering, but the way a person considered a proposal that had practical implications they needed to think through. "That depends," she said. "On what?" "On whether you are actually here to stop the cattle thieving, or whether you are here to give the territorial government a report that allows them to continue ignoring what is happening in this county. The directness of it hit him between the eyes. He sat with it for a moment. "I am here to stop it," he said. "Then yes," she said. "I will work with you." He rode back to Mesa Verde that night with the clean, borrowed shirt still on his back, and the image of her measuring look following him down the road like something attached. The next morning he went to see Sheriff Crow. Crow was a heavy man in his 50s with the red-faced look of a man who drank whiskey for reasons he had forgotten the original intention of. He occupied his office with the settled permanence of furniture, and he received Hugh with the particular warmth of a man who understood that a territorial marshal arriving to investigate a crime in his jurisdiction was an implicit commentary on his own performance. "I filed my reports," Crow said, before Hugh had gotten his coat off. "3 reports in 8 months, Hugh said. Each time the evidence led nowhere." "The evidence," Hugh said, "or the investigation?" Crow's face did the thing faces did when a man understood he was being accused and was calculating how much outrage he could display without making himself look defensive. He settled on a shade of red that fell between insult and warning. "I do not know what you have been told, Keating, but this is my county." "It is," Hugh said, "which is why I need your cooperation. I'm not here to embarrass you. I am here to catch the men responsible." He was not being entirely honest. He was also there to determine if Crow was one of the men responsible or merely the incompetent curtain behind which they had been operating. Both possibilities were open. "What do you need?" Crow said with the careful expression of a man deciding how much rope to offer. "Access to your records," Hugh said. "Every report, every complaint, every person who came to you about the thefts. And I need to know who in this county handles large cattle transactions." Crow gave him the records. Hugh read them that afternoon in a corner of the only saloon in Mesa Verde that had adequate lighting. And by the time he was done, he had a picture of an investigation that had been carefully steered away from anything that mattered. The reports were thorough where thoroughness was harmless and vague where vagueness protected something. It was work done by someone who understood exactly how much absence of information could be dressed to look like diligence. That evening he went back to the Langley ranch. He told himself it was because of the maps, and it was, in part. But when Ella came to the door with ink on her right hand and a slightly distracted expression that told him she had been in the middle of something, he felt a pull of interest that had nothing to do with maps or missing cattle, and he had the good sense at least to not let it show on his face. She led him to a room off the main house that she had clearly claimed as her own working space. A large table dominated the center of it, covered with paper, and what was on the paper stopped him in the doorway. She had mapped the entire eastern county, not in the rough, approximate way of a person sketching from memory, but with a precision that suggested she had walked every inch of the ground she was representing. The Quicksand Flats were rendered in detail that showed not just their extent but their internal structure, the hidden channels of solid ground that crossed them, the spots where the dangerous ground was deepest, the edges where it thinned to a navigable margin. The river was shown with its seasonal variations, marked in different inks. The fence lines of every ranch in the eastern section were present, with annotations he could not immediately read that turned out, when she explained them, to be her assessments of each fence's current condition, the year it was last repaired, and in several cases, specific sections she had identified as compromised. "You did all of this yourself," he said. "Over about 12 years, she said. "I started when I was 14. My father had been losing cattle to the flats for 3 years running, animals wandering in before anyone could stop them. I decided the only solution was to know the flats better than the cattle did." He walked along the edge of the table, looking at the maps, and the word that came into his mind was extraordinary, which he recognized as inadequate. It was the work of a scientific mind, patient and systematic and precise. Applied to the intimate geography of a landscape, she had made it her business to understand completely. It was the kind of survey work the territorial government paid men large salaries to do badly, and she had done it in her spare time with remarkable accuracy. "These annotations," he said, pointing to a series of markings along the Prout Ranch fence line. "What do these mean?" "Those indicate where the fence has been cut and reset," she said, coming to stand beside him. She was close enough that he was aware of her particular scent, clean soap and something faintly resinous like juniper, and he made himself focus on the map. "I first noticed it about 7 months ago. The cuts are always made in the same direction relative to the nearest water source, which suggests whoever is doing it knows where the cattle will go if they are pushed through." He looked at her. "You have been tracking this." "I have been watching it," she said carefully. "I did not know what it meant at first. It could have been Prout himself cutting and resetting his own fence for reasons of his own, but the pattern repeated 4 times in 5 months, always before a new report of missing stock from Prout's range. You think someone is running the cattle through Prout's fence and across your land to get them out of the county. I think someone is running them through the margin of the flats," she said. "The path I used to reach you yesterday. It is the only way to move animals in bulk through the eastern section, without being seen from the county road." He felt the thing click into place the way things clicked when the right information arrived at the right moment, that clean mechanical satisfaction of a lock opening. Someone was using her mapped path through the Quicksand Flats. Someone knew the path existed. "Who else knows about the solid ground through the flats?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "My father," she said. "Our 3 long-term ranch hands and 1 other person." She paused. "My father had a foreman for 2 years before I reorganized the night rotation. His name was Decker, Warren Decker. My father let him go 18 months ago when we discovered he had been falsifying the feed and supply ledgers." "Where is Decker now?" "I do not know," she said. "He left the county, my father believed. But I have been thinking." She hesitated, and he saw something move in her face that was not quite fear and not quite guilt, but was the expression of a person confronting an uncomfortable implication. "If Decker told someone about the path through the flats before he left, and if that person has been using it to move stolen cattle, then in a way, my work created the route they are exploiting." "No," he said, more firmly than he had intended. "Your work created the knowledge. Someone else's crime created the exploitation of it. Those are not the same thing." She looked at him with an expression that he could not entirely decode, but which had in it something that looked like relief, and something that looked like surprise that she was feeling relief, as if she had not expected someone to make that distinction on her behalf. "I want to show you something," she said, and moved to a different part of the table, where a separate set of pages lay. "I have been plotting the timing of the theft reports against the movement patterns I have observed in the flats. Not just the cut fences. I have been going out at night. Alone." She gave him a look that clearly said the question was beside the point. "I have been going out at night and watching from the high ground east of the flats. 3 times in the last 2 months I have seen movement. After dark, no lights. A group of riders pushing animals, maybe 15 to 20 head at a time, through the northern margin of the flats on the path I mapped and then east toward the territorial boundary." He stared at her. "You have witnesses to this." "Only myself," she said, "and a journal I have kept." She produced a small leather-bound notebook from a drawer and set it on the table. It was filled with the same careful handwriting as the map annotations, dated entries with precise times and descriptions. He picked it up and read 3 entries, and by the 3rd one he felt the solidifying of something in his chest that he identified, slowly, as a very particular kind of respect. The kind that you felt for a person who had been doing hard, risky, serious work in complete isolation and without acknowledgement, purely because they had decided it needed to be done. "Ella," he said, using her first name without deciding to, and felt her stillness beside him at the informality. "This evidence, combined with the fence-cut records and the maps, is the most organized picture of a criminal operation I have seen produced by anyone, lawman or otherwise, in 10 years of this work." The silence lasted long enough that he turned to look at her. She was looking at the table, and her jaw was set in a way that he understood, was the way a person held themselves when they were feeling something they had not given themselves permission to feel. "People around here think I am peculiar," she said finally, "obsessed with maps and notebooks when I ought to be thinking about other things." "Other things like what?" She looked up at him then, and her eyes held a directness that was almost confrontational. "You know what other things," she said. He did know. He was familiar with the particular pressure a woman of her age and situation felt from the world around her, the expectation that intelligence and capability were fine in their place, but should not be allowed to crowd out the correct priorities. He had seen it applied to women throughout his career with a casual cruelty that had always bothered him more than he generally said. "The people who think that are wrong," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that was not yet the thing it would become, but was the clear and unambiguous precursor to it. The recognition of one person by another as genuinely real, genuinely seen, genuinely mattered. "We should look at the timing patterns," she said, and looked back at the maps. He stayed until nearly midnight. The days that followed had a particular texture that Hugh would remember long afterward with a kind of gratitude for the exact specific quality of them. He rode out to the Langley ranch every morning, ostensibly to work through the evidence Ella had accumulated, and they worked through it with a focused seriousness that was real and necessary, but which was also threaded through with the growing awareness of each other that neither of them named or acknowledged out loud. She showed him how to read the Quicksand Flats, walking him along the solid path she had mapped, explaining the differences in surface color and texture that distinguished safe ground from dangerous ground, the way certain grasses grew along the buried sandstone channels that could bear weight and not along the unstable areas. She was a patient and precise teacher, and he was an attentive student, partly because the knowledge was genuinely useful and partly because watching her in her element, with that total absorbed confidence that she had when she was doing the thing she knew best, was one of the most compelling things he had ever witnessed. She had a habit of thinking out loud when she was working through a problem, a running commentary on her own reasoning that was fascinating to listen to, not because it was performed for him, but because it was not. She seemed to forget sometimes that he was there, and he found he enjoyed those moments most, when she was fully inhabiting her own mind, and he was simply in the vicinity of it. He told her things too, in those working days, things he did not usually tell people. About his early years in Kansas, about the years of building a reputation for reliability in territories that were hard on reliability. About the specific loneliness of the kind of work he did, moving through counties and towns and never belonging to any of them. He told her these things not in the mode of confessing but in the mode of conversation, which he had not had for a long time. On the fourth day, they found Warren Decker. Or rather, Hugh's contact in the territorial office found him, through the paper trail of a cattle broker in Raton, who had been receiving unusual volumes of beef from an unnamed southern supplier over the past 8 months. The broker, under pressure from a federal inquiry that Hugh had quietly initiated on his second day in the territory, had produced a name. Warren Decker, operating under a false business name but using an address in Mesa Verde that turned out to be the back room of Sheriff Crow's own office. Hugh sat with that piece of information for a full hour before he told Ella, because he needed to think about what it implied and what it did not imply, and because he was aware that the moment he told her, the quiet working companionship of the past days would become something harder and more dangerous. He told her that evening in her map room. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time, looking at the map of the county road and the route from the flats to the territorial boundary. Then she said, "Crow knew about the path through the flats. He may have, if Decker told him. Which means when you walked in off the South Trail," she said, and something tightened in her voice, "there is a possibility that someone wanted you to go that way." He had reached this conclusion himself already in the private hour before he came to her. Hearing her reach it independently by the same steps, was both confirming and disturbing. "Yes," he said. "It was convenient that Crow was the one who gave me directions to the eastern section. A man of your experience would have gone around the flats if he had known they were there," she said. "Crow would know that a stranger riding in from the west, directed to the south trail, would have no reason to know about the flats. He would just ride across what looked like open desert." "And not come out," Hugh said. The silence in the room had a specific weight. "He tried to kill you," she said. Not with alarm, but with the careful, measured tone of a person arriving at a fact and placing it where it belonged in their understanding. "It appears so," Hugh said, "which means he knows I am closer to the truth than he thought I would get. And it means your name is probably connected to mine in whatever intelligence he has been gathering, since I have been riding out here every day for a week." She looked at him with the measuring expression that he had come to recognize as her primary mode of assessment, not of him specifically, but of any new variable in her understanding of a situation. "What do we need to do?" she said. "I need to bring Crow and Decker in," he said. "But I cannot do it through Crow's office because Crow is the office. I need to send for a federal deputy from Taos, and I need evidence solid enough that the territorial government cannot ignore it or bury it." He paused. "Your journal and your maps would be the centerpiece of that evidence." "Then you can have them," she said, without hesitation. "It could put you in the middle of a federal case," he said, "with a corrupt sheriff who has already tried to have me killed. There is a real danger to it." She looked at him with an expression that held something that was not impatience but was adjacent to it. "Marshal Keating," she said, "I have been going out alone at night in the dark to watch criminals move stolen cattle across dangerous ground and recording it in a private journal that no one knew existed for 2 months, on the chance that someday someone would come to this county who actually wanted to use the information. I am aware of the danger." He stared at her. The full weight of it landed on him then, not as abstract information but as something visceral and specific. What she had been doing, alone in the dark, at real personal risk, without any guarantee that it would ever matter, because she had decided it needed to be done. He thought about the nights she had spent on the high ground east of the flats, watching through cold desert darkness, writing in her leather notebook, driving back alone before dawn. He thought about the years of the maps, the years of learning every inch of ground that had been lethal to her family's cattle, the years of doing serious, necessary, unacknowledged work in a world that kept suggesting she should be doing something else. He felt something break open in his chest in a way that was not pain but was deeply disorienting, because he had never felt it before. "I know that," he said quietly. "I want you to know that I know that." She looked at him for a moment, and the measuring quality in her eyes gave way to something that was simply open, simply real, and he felt the disorienting warmth of being looked at directly by this particular woman as herself, rather than as the navigator of their practical situation. "All right," she said, after a moment, her voice slightly different in texture. "Then let us figure out how to bring them in." They spent the next 2 days in a careful, strategic operation that Hugh coordinated with a quiet efficiency that Ella respected, because she could see the calculation behind it. He sent his request for a federal deputy by courier on a route that did not pass through Crow's office, using a rancher named Adelman who owed him a favor, and whose distrust of Crow was a matter of public record. He also quietly spoke with 3 other ranchers who had lost cattle, and with Ella's detailed maps as his presentation, laid out the operation that had been preying on them in terms specific enough to make 3 previously cautious men very willing to testify. On the 6th day, Ella came to him in the morning with something new. "I went out last night," she said, before he could protest, because he could see she was anticipating a protest and had decided to preempt it. "I know you would have preferred I did not, but I needed to see the current condition of the North Margin Path before we have the federal deputy here to make sure it is still passable and to document any recent tracks." And there were tracks," she said, "fresh, within the last 2 days. Someone ran cattle through the Flats path 2 nights ago. I estimated from the track depth and spread roughly 30 head. She produced her notebook, open to the most recent entry. They are accelerating. I think they know that time is running short. Hugh looked at the entry and felt the familiar pressure of a case moving faster than the plan designed to resolve it. How long before the federal deputy arrives? The courier would have reached Taos yesterday. If he rode fast and a deputy was available to ride immediately, 5 days at the outside. We may not have 5 days, he said. They looked at each other across the map table. There is another option, Ella said. Not a safe one. Tell me. If we could document a live operation, with witnesses present at the observation point when the cattle are moved, the case becomes airtight regardless of what Crow tries to do to suppress it. The Adelman Ranch is near enough to the high ground east of the flats. If Prout and Adelman were positioned there with us when the next move happens, their testimony would be direct and credible. He thought about it. He thought about the risk of having civilians in the field in a situation that had already proven to involve at least one man willing to commit murder. He thought about the alternative, which was waiting while cattle thieves cleared their stock and disappeared and evidence evaporated, and Crow had time to figure out that his chosen method of dealing with the marshal had failed. The risk, he started, is manageable, she said. The observation point is elevated and screened. We would not be intercepting the operation, only watching it and documenting it. There would be no direct contact. He studied her. She had clearly thought this through before she came to him. She presented it as a logical option rather than an argument, which was the kind of thing he appreciated in a person, and which also made him more cautious, because the things that felt most logical in the middle of an investigation were sometimes the things that went most wrong. All right, he said. But we do this my way. I set the positions. No one moves without my direction, and you stay at my side the whole time. Something flickered in her expression at the last condition, and he was aware that she was deciding how to receive it. Was it protective? Was it possessive? Was it pragmatic? He found he wanted to be honest about which it was. Not because I do not trust your judgment, he said. Because if something goes wrong, I want to know exactly where you are. She looked at him for a moment with that open, real expression that he was beginning to think was the most valuable thing he had ever been given the chance to see. All right, she said quietly. They organized the observation the following day, riding out with Prout and Adelman to the high ground east of the Quicksand Flats as the late afternoon sun turned the desert to copper. Hugh positioned them in a screened outcrop of red rock that gave a clear view of the northern margin of the flats and the trail east toward the territorial boundary, and they settled in to wait. Ella sat beside him in the narrow space between two large boulders. In the cooling evening air she had pulled on a canvas jacket, and she was very still in the particular way she had of being still, not tense but contained, all of her attention aimed outward at the landscape below them. He was watching the same landscape, but he was also aware of her shoulder an inch from his, of her breathing, slow and even and calm. "You are not afraid," he said, quietly enough that only she heard it. "I am a little afraid," she said, equally quiet. "I just think clearly when I am afraid. Some people freeze, I sharpen." "I know the feeling," he said, and glanced at her sideways and found she was already looking at him. They looked at each other for a moment in the gathering dusk, and he felt the weight of everything between them, the days of work and conversation and the slow, careful accumulation of knowing each other, pressing against the space between them with a pressure that was not uncomfortable but was clearly there. "Hugh," she said, and the use of his first name surprised him enough that he held very still. But then Adelman, from his position 10 feet further along the outcrop, said, low and urgent, "Movement. South margin," and they both turned to look. The cattle came through in the way Ella had described. No lights, no noise beyond the movement of hooves on the path Ella had mapped. A dark shifting mass of animals pushed by 4 riders whose silhouettes were dark against the lighter ground of the flat's margin. They moved with practiced efficiency. The riders spaced in a pattern that kept the cattle tightly bunched, and moving steadily east, and they used the path through the flats with a confidence that said they had used it many times. Hugh had a small set of field glasses that he trained on the riders, and in the starlight and the faint half-moon he could make out enough. He recognized Decker from the description he had been given, a tall man with a distinctive riding posture, straight-backed and left-leaning. The other three he did not know. He also saw at the back of the group, riding wide to the right of the cattle, a fifth figure he had not expected. He handed the glasses to Ella without speaking. She looked for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "That is Tom Crow, the sheriff himself, in the field, personally overseeing a cattle operation on the trail through the Quicksand Flats." Beside them, Pruitt had seen it too, and the sound he made was low and harsh, the sound of a man whose quiet suspicions have just been confirmed at a cost that has not yet been fully calculated. "Stay here," Hugh said to all three of them. "What are you going to do?" Ella asked. He checked his Colt single-action Army revolver, 1881 model, .45 caliber, 6 shots, and he had a second cylinder in his vest pocket. "I am going to read them their warrants," he said, "and arrest as many of them as I can without starting a firefight I cannot finish." "There are 5 of them," she said, and her voice was very even, which he understood was the way she handled being frightened, not with trembling but with perfect stillness. "Yes," he said, "stay in position." He moved down the slope in the dark, using the cover of the rock formations to his advantage, and came out onto the flat eastern ground 40 yards ahead of the lead rider's projected path, where a stand of juniper gave him shadow, and a position that forced the approaching group to stop or ride directly into him. What followed was the kind of standoff that depended entirely on the nerve of the man demanding it, and Hugh had considerable nerve. He stepped into the open when the lead rider was 20 yards away, badge forward, voice carrying in the night air with the flat calm of a man who had done this before and expected it to resolve in his favor. "United States Marshal Hugh Keating, you are all under arrest. Drop your weapons and dismount." The cattle scattered in 6 directions. The riders did not immediately comply, which was expected. There was a moment of shouted profanity and wheeling horses, and then 3 things happened almost simultaneously. Decker went for his gun, one of the unknown riders turned his horse and ran east, and Tom Crow, at the back of the group, raised his own weapon. Hugh shot Decker's gun out of his hand before it cleared its holster, which was an exceptional piece of marksmanship, and also the single action that resolved the standoff, because Decker's scream of pain and surprise had the effect of making the other men present very clear about what the cost of resistance looked like. Crow lowered his weapon. Hugh moved through the arrested men with the practiced speed of long experience, disarming them, securing them with the handcuffs he carried, tying Decker's wrist. The man who had run east was a problem for another day. He had 3 of the 5, including Crow and Decker. He looked up at the rock outcrop. 3 figures were visible against the sky where he had left them. One of them was already moving down the slope toward him with a confident, sure-footed pace that he recognized. She reached him and looked at the arrested men and then at him, and her eyes moved over him in the particular way that said she was checking for injury, quickly and efficiently, before she allowed herself anything else. "You are all right," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at Crow, who was sitting on the ground with his hands cuffed behind him, and an expression on his face that had passed through outrage and shame, and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of a man calculating his remaining options. "Crow," she said, and her voice held something cold and clear, the voice of a woman who had been watching her neighbor's livelihood stolen for 8 months and had been doing all the work of documenting it alone without anyone listening. "Your operation used a path that I spent 12 years mapping. A path I mapped because animals were dying in that ground and someone needed to know how to save them. And you used it to steal." Crow said nothing. "You will not use it again," she said. Pruitt came down from the slope and looked at Crow with an expression of pure, clear rage that he kept behind his teeth. Adelman was quieter, but his expression said the same thing. These were men who had lost hundreds of head of cattle to an operation run by the man who was supposed to be protecting them, and the accounting of that loss was going to take a long time. Hugh organized the march back to Mesa Verde that night, with the prisoners walking and the 3 ranchers riding their horses in rotation as escort, and he walked Atlas at the rear of the group, and Ella rode beside him because there was nowhere else either of them particularly wanted to be. They did not speak much. The night was very big around them, and the desert had its own sounds: the wind in the scrub, the distant movement of something in the rock, the particular silence that was not silence at all, but the accumulation of small sounds the land made in the dark. He was tired in the way he was always tired after the moment of maximum danger had passed, and the body remembered that it had been afraid, and she was quiet beside him in the way she was quiet when she was thinking through the full implications of something. "What happens next?" she asked, after a while. "Crow and Decker and the 3rd man go into federal custody when the deputy arrives," he said. "The broker in Raton is already under federal inquiry. The operation ends. The remaining question is recovering restitution for the ranchers who lost stock, which may take longer and may be imperfect." "The cattle are gone," she said, not with bitterness but with the acknowledgement of a person who understood that some losses could not be entirely undone. "Some of them can be traced and returned," he said. "We will get the broker's records. The territorial government will make some effort at reparation. It will not be everything. These things rarely are." She nodded, absorbing this with the same even temperament she brought to everything. Then she said quietly, "What happens to you?" He glanced at her. She was looking straight ahead at the dark road, and her profile in the moonlight was very clear: the straight line of her nose, the set of her mouth, the way she held herself on her horse like someone who belonged exactly where she was. "I go back to Taos," he said. "After the case is concluded, file my report, take the next assignment." The silence that followed that statement had a specific texture that he recognized as the silence of something that wanted to be said and was not being said yet. "There does not need to be a next assignment immediately," he said after a while. She did not look at him, but the set of her shoulders changed slightly, something softening in the line of them. "No," she said, "there does not." They rode the rest of the way into Mesa Verde in the particular companionable quiet of 2 people who have said the important thing at an angle and are sitting with the knowledge of what they have said. He handed Crow and the others over to the temporary custody of 3 trustworthy citizens until the federal deputy arrived, a solution that Adelman organized with businesslike efficiency, because he had a deep personal interest in the prisoners remaining securely held. Then he rode back out to the Langley ranch in the small hours, because he could not go back to his hotel room in Mesa Verde without passing by Crow's office, which seemed in poor taste. Caleb Langley was awake when they arrived, sitting on the front porch with a lamp and a cold cup of coffee, waiting the way a father waited when his daughter had ridden out into danger he could not follow her into. He stood when he saw them, and the exhaustion and relief in his face when he saw Ella dismount safely were the emotions of a man who had known fear that night and had not let it show to anyone. "It is done?" he asked. "It is done," Ella said, and went to her father and received the careful embrace of a man who was too proud to have said how frightened he was and too honest to have hidden all of it. And Hugh looked away from that private moment and tended to his horse. In the morning, he slept until noon for the first time in years. The federal deputy arrived from Taos on the 4th day, a young man named Vasquez who was efficient and slightly overwhelmed by the volume of evidence Ella had prepared for him. He spent 2 days going through her journals and maps and the testimony of the ranchers with the expression of someone who had expected to be collecting field notes and had instead been handed a fully documented federal case. "Who prepared these?" he asked Hugh, holding up the maps. "Ella Langley," Hugh said. "You will want to ensure her name is formally credited in the case documentation." Vasquez looked at the maps again. "This is survey quality work," he said. "Yes," Hugh said. "It is." The prisoners were transported to Santa Fe for trial. The broker in Raton cooperated in exchange for a reduced sentence and provided the paper trail that traced the stolen cattle through 3 subsequent sales, allowing the territorial government to begin the process of assessing what restitution was possible. It was not a perfect resolution, because perfect resolutions were not a feature of the world Hugh Keating worked in, but it was a real one, and the 8 months of organized theft that had been bleeding the eastern county's ranching community came definitively to an end. Crow went to prison. Decker went to prison. The third arrested man, who turned out to have a name Hugh had encountered in a warrant from Colorado, went to federal custody in Denver and became someone else's accounting. The man who had escaped east was never caught. Hugh looked for him for 2 weeks in the territorial boundary region and did not find him, and eventually the investigation concluded without him, which was the imperfect part he had predicted to Ella on the night ride back. The one that got away. There was always one. Through all of this, he was at the Langley ranch most days. He told himself it was for the case, and for the first week it was mostly true, because Vasquez needed access to Ella's documentation, and Hugh was the natural bridge between that process and the federal deputy. But the case concluded with formal documentation in the second week, and he was at the Langley ranch still. Caleb Langley observed this with the quiet attention of a man who had lived long enough to know what he was seeing, and was not going to say anything about it until he understood how it was going to go. He treated Hugh with a careful respect that was warm but not fully open, the guardedness of a father who was watching someone in the vicinity of a person he valued. One afternoon, Caleb found Hugh helping one of the ranch hands repair a section of the eastern fence line without being asked, in the methodical way of a man who was making himself useful because he wanted a reason to be somewhere, and he stood watching for a while and then said, "She is not easy to know." Hugh kept working. "I know that," he said. "She has been turned into something small by people trying to make her fit a place she does not fit," Caleb said. "She has come through that with the map room and the journals and a very long patience, and she is not going to give any of that away for a man who admires the competence but does not want to live next to it every day." Hugh stopped working and looked at the older man. "I do not want to reduce it," he said. "I want to be near it." Caleb studied him for a long moment with those dark measuring eyes that were so much like his daughter's. Then he said, "Fair enough," and walked back toward the house. That evening after supper, Hugh asked Ella to walk with him. She said yes without hesitation, which he found in that moment an extraordinary gift. The evening was cool, and the sky over the desert was doing the thing it did in New Mexico in the fall, filling itself with colors so specific and transient that trying to name them felt insufficient. They walked along the east fence line toward the rise that gave a view of the Quicksand Flats in the last of the light, and she walked beside him with that easy, unhurried pace of a woman in a place she knew and loved. "I have been thinking," he said, when they had reached the rise and stopped, looking out at the flats, pale and quietly lethal in the evening light. "I could tell," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the flats with the particular expression she had when she was looking at something she knew completely, the quiet satisfaction of comprehensive knowledge. In the evening light, her face was very clear and very real. "I told you I go back to Taos," he said. "That is true. I have a report to file and a set of administrative matters to conclude." "Yes," she said, "but Taos is not a permanent assignment. I have been a traveling marshal for 9 years because I had no particular reason to stop traveling." He paused. "This county is going to need a new sheriff, a legitimate one. The territorial government will appoint someone, but there is no obvious candidate and no obvious infrastructure for the office." She turned to look at him fully. "You are thinking about the appointment." "I am thinking about whether the appointment is something I want to pursue," he said. "And I am thinking about that question in the context of reasons I might have to be specifically in this county rather than the next one." She was very still, and the stillness had a different quality than her usual self-containment. It was the stillness of a person holding something very carefully. "Hugh," she said, and her voice had that slightly different texture again, the texture it had when she said his name as herself rather than as the person navigating a situation. "I want to say something, and I want you to tell me if I have understood you correctly, because I do not do well with things left unsaid and later regretted." "Then say it," he said. "You are not just thinking about a job," she said. "You are thinking about staying here in this county because of me." "Yes," he said. "That is correct." Another stillness. The desert evening moved around them, the wind in the juniper, the last copper edge of the sun behind the western ridge. He waited because she needed the space to arrive at whatever she was going to arrive at without him filling it with words. "I have spent a significant portion of my life," she said, "being told that the things I care about most, the maps, the study of the land, the work I do because it matters and not because someone asked me to, are at best a charming peculiarity and at worst a reason I am difficult to accommodate." "I know," he said. "You do not look at me like that," she said. "You look at me like I am the most sensible person in the room, which is both very gratifying and also somewhat unfamiliar." "You are usually the most sensible person in the room," he said, "sometimes the only one." Something crossed her face then that was open and warm and unguarded, and she laughed quietly, a brief real sound that he felt in his own chest. "That is very kind and probably not accurate," she said. "It is both kind and accurate," he said. "Ella." He said her name slowly, with the full weight of everything he meant by it. "I am not asking you to be less than what you are. I am not asking you to put the maps away. I am asking if you are willing, if you would consider the possibility of me." She looked at him for a long moment in the evening light. This woman who had mapped the most dangerous ground in the county and walked it alone in the dark and saved his life with a rope and a knowledge of physics, and done all of it without anyone asking her to and without anyone thanking her until him. She looked at him with those dark, clear, measuring eyes, and what he saw in them was not the measuring quality this time, but something that had come through the measuring and arrived on the other side of it. "I have been considering the possibility of you," she said quietly, "since you looked at my map table and called it extraordinary." He reached out and took her hand. It was a simple thing, a large hand closing around a smaller one, and she let him, and they stood at the edge of the rise above the Quicksand Flats as the last light left the desert sky, and it felt, to both of them, like standing on the solid path through something that had been treacherous for a long time. He did not kiss her that evening. He thought about it, but he was a man who did things with intention and not impulse, and what he wanted was to do this correctly, with the full weight of seriousness that she deserved. So he held her hand in the evening and they walked back to the ranch together, and when he rode back to Mesa Verde, he was a different kind of light than he had been in a very long time. He wrote to Taos that week. He filed his report, which cited Ella Langley's investigative work explicitly and in detail. And then he wrote a separate letter of recommendation to the territorial government regarding the sheriff's appointment, in which he made the case for his own candidacy in direct and unambiguous terms. He also wrote a personal letter to his supervisor in Taos, a man named Marcus Webb who had known him for 7 years, saying that he was intending to put down roots and that Marcus should begin looking for a replacement for the traveling circuit. Marcus wrote back promptly, which surprised Hugh, because Marcus was not a man who wrote promptly. The letter said, in its essential content, that it was about time, and that the territorial government had already approved the sheriff's appointment pending Hugh's formal application, apparently on the strength of the cattle case documentation and the backing of several prominent ranchers in the county. Hugh read this letter in his hotel room in Mesa Verde on a Wednesday morning and felt a complicated, layered happiness that was not simple enough to be described easily, but which was real and deep and had a future attached to it. He went to the Langley ranch that afternoon with the letter in his pocket. He found Ella in the barn, not in the map room, checking the hoof of a roan gelding with the focused attention she brought to everything physical on the ranch. She had the hoof up on her knee and was working at a small stone caught in the shoe with a pick, and she did not look up when he came in, because she was mid-task and finishing mid-tasks was important to her. He waited. The barn smelled of hay and horses and the particular wormwood smell of old timber, and Atlas, in a stall he had been occupying for 3 weeks now with the settled comfort of a horse that had found his barn, nickered at him softly. Ella set the hoof down, straightened, tucked the pick in her pocket. Then she looked at him and saw something in his expression and tilted her head slightly in the questioning way she had. "Something has happened," she said. "Something has happened," he agreed and told her. She listened to the full account of the letters and the appointment and the conversation with Marcus Webb with the same careful attention she gave everything, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You are going to stay." "If you will have me," he said. The directness of it landed between them with a clarity that needed no further elaboration. He was not just talking about the county. She knew that. He knew she knew that. She crossed the distance between them in the barn with the same purposeful stride she had when she was moving toward something she had decided, and she put her hands on either side of his face, because she was tall enough to reach, and because she was not a woman who did halfway things when she had decided, and she kissed him. It was a direct, clear, unambiguous kiss, and it held in it everything she was, the precision and the intelligence and the deep, warm capability of her, and he kissed her back with everything he was, and the bay horse in the stall next door made a sound of mild equine interest, and the barn was full of golden afternoon light. And it was the best thing that had happened to Hugh Keating in 31 years of a life that had contained some very good things. When she stepped back, her eyes were very bright and her expression had that open, real quality that he had decided was the most valuable thing he would ever see. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." Caleb Langley, who had seen Hugh ride up and had decided not to go to the barn for approximately 15 minutes, came in just as they were separating and looked at them both with the expression of a man who had known this was coming and had also understood that it was good. He said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at Hugh and said, "You will want to speak to me." "Yes, sir," Hugh said. "I will." They spoke that evening, on the front porch with the lamps lit and Ella inside in the kitchen making coffee, because she had accepted that certain conversations between men happened in a particular format, and she was willing to let the format run its course. It was not an anxious conversation. Caleb Langley was not a man who created anxiety where there was no cause for it, and what Hugh had to say to him was simple and honest, that he intended to marry his daughter if she would agree to it, that he understood what she was and valued it completely, that he was a man capable of being in one place and committed to being in this one, and that he was aware that what Caleb was trusting him with was something specific and irreplaceable. Caleb listened to all of it and then said, "She will agree to it." "She has already decided." He paused. "She decided a week ago, I think. She just needed you to catch up." Hugh laughed, which was the kind of laugh that came from a place of real pleasure rather than performance, and Caleb Langley laughed too, and Ella came out with 3 cups of coffee and looked at the 2 laughing men with an expression of mild suspicion that she moderated to tolerance when Hugh looked at her. "What did you say to each other?" she asked. "Nothing that was not accurate," Hugh said. She handed him his coffee and held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was fond and also slightly wary, which he understood was going to be a recurring feature of knowing her, and which he found he was deeply happy about. He proposed to her properly the following Sunday, in the map room, which was where he had decided she should be proposed to, because it was the most her room in her world. He brought no flowers, because he was not a man who dealt in gesture when substance was available, and he said what he meant in the plain, direct terms he always used for important things, and she said yes before he had finished the sentence, which told him that she had been waiting for the question with a patience that was entirely characteristic of her. They were married in the spring, in 1883, in a small ceremony in the Mesa Verde Church, with Caleb Langley giving his daughter away with an expression of quiet, proud emotion, and Marcus Webb making the journey from Taos, because he said someone had to represent the marshal's office in a way that didn't embarrass it. Adelman and Prout and 3 other ranching families attended, because the case had created a community of people who felt they owed the Langleys something, and also because the wedding of the county's new sheriff and the woman who had effectively built the case that justified his appointment was a community event whether they treated it as one or not. Ella wore a dress the color of the desert sky in October, which she had made herself with the same precise attention she brought to her maps, and Hugh, in the good suit he had ridden all the way to Santa Fe to acquire, thought when she came down the aisle that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and also that beauty was the least important thing about her, and the combination of those 2 facts was exactly what love was supposed to feel like. He took up the sheriff's position in Mesa Verde formally that spring, operating out of a rebuilt office that Crow's occupancy had left in a state requiring reconstruction both physical and moral. He was a thorough and fair sheriff, the kind the county had needed, and he brought to the work the same steady patience and clear-eyed assessment that had made him effective as a marshal. He was not a violent man by preference, and the county under his tenure became notably safer than it had been, not because he was feared but because he was trusted, which was a different and more durable thing. Ella became the county surveyor, which was not an official position because no such official position existed in 1883, but which was what she effectively was. She continued her mapping work, expanding it from the Langley eastern section to the full county, and the territorial government eventually commissioned a formal survey of Cimarron County and hired her as the lead surveyor, which was unusual enough to generate commentary in Santa Fe, and which she ignored completely because the commentary was not relevant to the work. She also, in their first year of marriage, taught 3 of the neighboring ranchers' daughters how to navigate the Quicksand Flats. Not because it was necessary for all of them, but because she had decided that the knowledge of how to move safely through dangerous ground should not be held by only one person, and she was constitutionally incapable of keeping useful knowledge to herself when it could be shared. They lived in the Langley house at first, with Caleb, who was company they both valued, and who occupied his end of the house with a self-sufficient dignity that required nothing of them, and gave its own quiet warmth to the household. Ella had her map room. Hugh had the study he gradually claimed from the general-purpose room off the front hall. They ate together in the evenings and they argued sometimes, not with anger but with the particular friction of 2 opinionated and capable people who did not defer to each other on instinct and had to work out the shape of their shared life through honest engagement. It was good friction. It made things better. In the fall of 1883, Ella told Hugh she was expecting a child with the same directness she brought to everything, and Hugh, who had thought himself a man not given to overwhelming emotion, sat down in his chair and felt a wave of feeling pass through him that required several minutes to fully process. Their first child was born in the summer of 1884, a boy they named Caleb James Keating, after his grandfather on one side and Hugh's father on the other. Old Caleb Langley held his grandson on the evening of his birth with an expression of such complete and uncomplicated joy that Hugh had to look away from it because it was too full to look at directly. The boy had his mother's eyes. Caleb Langley's health began to fail in the winter of 1885, in the way of a man whose body had given long and honest service and was beginning, at last, to present its accounts. He remained mentally sharp and was sharply opinionated about the management of his ranch until the last months, which Ella managed with a combination of patient affection and firm practicality that was entirely characteristic of her. He died in early spring of 1886 in the house he had built and on the land he had worked all his life, with his daughter's hand in his and his grandson asleep in the next room, and Hugh sat with them both in the quiet of that evening and felt the specific weight of a man's life completed, which was heavy and also something else, something that was not quite peace but was in the vicinity of it. Ella grieved her father with the same contained depth she brought to everything, and Hugh learned in those weeks what it meant to be the person someone turned to with the weight of a private sorrow, and he held that responsibility with all the care it deserved. They inherited the Langley ranch in full, and the question of what to do with it resolved itself naturally. They kept it. Hugh rode between the ranch and Mesa Verde on a schedule that worked for both the position and the land, and Ella managed the ranch with the help of the long-term hands who had been there for years, and whom she trusted, and who trusted her. She was a thorough and capable rancher, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. In 1886, their second child arrived, a girl they named Margaret Clara, called Maggie from her first week, who arrived in the world with a set of opinions that she began expressing at volume immediately and did not moderate for the rest of her childhood. Hugh took the children to the Quicksand Flats when they were old enough to be curious, and Ella taught them the path with the same patient precision she brought to every teaching. Young Caleb was methodical about it, careful and slow, checking each step before he committed to it, very much his father's son in his approach to uncertain ground. Maggie, to no one's great surprise, had her mother's instinct for it, moving along the solid path with a confidence that slightly alarmed her father until he recognized what he was watching. "She knows it," he said to Ella, watching their daughter pick her way across the margin of the flats with the ease of someone reading familiar ground. "She knows it," Ella agreed, and the satisfaction in her voice was warm and complete. The county continued to change around them, in the way the whole territory was changing, the slow, inevitable movement of settlement and infrastructure that was transforming the wild open country into something more organized and more complex, and sometimes more just and sometimes less. Hugh served as sheriff for 7 years, and when he finally stepped down in 1889 to give the position to a younger man he had spent 2 years training, the county held a dinner for him that he found genuinely embarrassing and genuinely moving in equal measure. Ella's surveying work had by then become so significant that the territorial government's land office in Santa Fe employed her formally, the first woman in the territory to hold a professional government cartographic position, which was noted in the Santa Fe newspaper with the measured tone of people reporting something unusual that they had not yet decided how to feel about. Ella read the article and declined to feel anything about their uncertainty, because she had a survey of the northern county to complete, and the spring melt was affecting the river line she needed to document. They had a third child in 1890, another boy, whom they named Thomas after Hugh's older brother who had died in the war before Hugh was old enough to have known him well, and whose absence had been a quiet absence his whole life. Thomas Keating arrived in October and was from the beginning a serene, observant child who watched the world with the particular patience of someone who was taking detailed notes. Hugh, watching his 3 children grow up in the specific landscape of the county, in the house built by Ella's father, and the mapping room that was full of Ella's life's work and the stories they had made themselves, felt the word home in a way he had not felt it since childhood, not as a place assigned but as a place chosen, made, worth. The Quicksand Flats were still there. They were always there, pale and quiet and patient, the most dangerous ground in the county, and Ella's maps of them were the most detailed and accurate document of any geological feature in the territory. The path she had mapped was still the path, unchanged, because the sandstone shelf beneath it was unchanged, the stable foundation that ran under the treacherous surface and made safe passage possible for anyone who knew where it was. Travelers still got into trouble in the flats from time to time, as travelers would, because the ground looked harmless and the harm was hidden, and whenever it happened the Keating family was the family the county sent for, because Ella knew the path and had taught it to her children and her children would teach it to theirs. Hugh was out on a Thursday morning, mending fence on the northern section of the ranch with young Caleb, who at 14 was as useful a ranch hand as most grown men, when Ella rode up on the dun mare, which was not the original dun mare of their meeting, but the granddaughter of it, bred from the same careful stock Ella had always selected for reliability over flash. She pulled up beside him and he looked at her, and she looked at him the way she had been looking at him for 7 years, with the measuring quality that was no longer purely measurement but was shot through with all the knowledge and history they had accumulated, and with the open, real quality that had always been there underneath the measurement, the quality he had first seen on the rise above the Quicksand Flats in the evening light. "There is a man stuck in the south margin," she said. "A buyer from Albuquerque, apparently. He rode in on the county road and went off the south trail." Hugh looked at his son, who was already reading his father's expression and gathering the fence tools with the efficiency of a boy who had been raised on practical action. "Does he need help?" Hugh asked. "He needs the path," Ella said. "Can you take him out?" "Yes," she said. "I always can." She paused, and a small, precise smile moved across her face. "I thought you might want to come, for old times." He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had saved his life with a rope and a knowledge of physics and the patient work of 12 years, and had then, with the same methodical, unhurried precision, saved the rest of his life by being in it. He felt the full weight of all of it in that moment, the gratitude that was not a small or polite thing but was large and specific and woven through every day. "For old times," he said, and went to get his horse. They rode south together across the Langley land, through the scrub juniper and the red rock country that she knew better than she knew her own hands, into the high clear morning of the New Mexico territory, and beside him on the dun mare she sat her saddle with that same easy, balanced authority she had always had, and the sun was up and the desert was enormous around them, and it was a good day to know exactly where the solid ground was. She always knew. She always had. And he had been smart enough that first day in the Quicksand Flats, with his chest sinking into the earth and his dignity somewhere at the bottom, to stop struggling and let her pull him out, and to follow her toward solid ground when she offered it, and to stay on it when he found it. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.